The year was 1963. The conflict was not fought with ballistics, but with poultry. In post-war Europe, West Germany imposed a tax on American chicken to protect their farmers. The United States did not hesitate to escalate. They retaliated with a 25% tariff on light trucks, aiming a direct financial weapon at German manufacturers like Volkswagen. The trade dispute effectively ended decades ago. West Germany does not even exist on a map today. Yet that 25% tax on trucks remains the law of the land. It is zombie policy that has quietly dictated the structure of the global auto industry for 60 years. It stands as a cold testament to a single rule of governance. Temporary economic measures in Washington have a terrifying habit of becoming permanent financial realities. Fast forward to the 2026 horizon. The strategy has evolved from a targeted strike to a total economic siege. President Donald Trump's blueprint for a second term proposes a universal baseline tariff of up to 20% on all foreign nations, and a staggering 60% levy on China. This is not standard protectionism. It is a fundamental shift in the architecture of the US dollar. The objective is to utilize these tariffs as a massive new revenue stream, theoretically allowing for the elimination of federal income tax by shifting the burden to consumption. It is labeled as economic nationalism, but the data suggests a different outcome. History confirms that when trade walls are erected, the bill is rarely paid by the foreign adversary. It is paid by the holder of the currency. The system is being re-engineered and the cost of entry is about to change. This is the anatomy of the coming trade war. To understand the mechanics of the 2026 blueprint, one must first dissect the sales pitch. It is a narrative that has been carefully refined, not in university lecture halls, but at rallies and on televised debates. It begins with a term that Donald Trump has explicitly embraced: economic nationalism. For the skeptical observer, the individual who has watched American manufacturing hollow out over the last 3 decades, this term does not sound like a threat, it sounds like a correction. The political argument is built on a powerful psychological foundation, the idea that the United States has been the victim of a global heist. The narrative suggests that for nearly a century, America has subsidized the world's growth while its own industrial base was stripped for parts. As Trump himself stated regarding foreign nations, countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world. This is the hook. It appeals directly to the truth seeker who suspects the game is rigged. It validates the anger of the worker who believes the system was designed to export their livelihood when the proposal is framed as a debt collection agency coming for the world's overdue bills. The imposition of a 60% tariff on China stops looking like a tax policy and starts looking like justice. The genius of this rhetoric lies in its simplicity. Trump rejects the complex models of modern economists. He simplifies the equation down to what he calls common sense. The logic presented to the voter is linear, almost seductive in its clarity. It goes like this. Foreign companies are dumping cheap goods into our market, undercutting our factories. If we slap a massive tax on those goods, their prices will rise. Suddenly, the American-made alternative becomes the competitive option. In this kitchen table version of economics, the outcome seems guaranteed. Demand shifts domestically. Idle factories roar back to life. Wages rise because labor is in high demand. The foreign adversary is punished, and the American worker is rewarded. It feels intuitive. It feels like simple arithmetic. If you want to protect your house, you build a wall. If you want to protect your economy, you build a tariff. We have seen this play out before, not as a theoretical exercise, but as federal policy. Flashback to 2018. The target was not the entire global order yet. It was specific industries, most notably washing machines. The administration imposed tariffs with a very specific public promise. The claim was that these measures would benefit our consumers and create a lot of jobs. The optics were perfect. It was the test case for the America First doctrine. By taxing Samsung and LG, the administration aimed to force them to open plants on U.S. soil, while simultaneously giving domestic giants, like Whirlpool, the breathing room to dominate the market. On paper, it was a masterstroke of leverage. It was the populist mirage in its purest form, a policy that promised to punish the cheaters and pay the citizens simultaneously. But economics is rarely as linear as the campaign slogan. While the logic of making them pay sounds perfect on a microphone, the mechanism of how money actually moves through a port of entry is a different beast entirely. When the rhetoric fades and the invoices are actually printed, the reality of who writes the check begins to emerge. And it is not the foreign government. The illusion of the free lunch is about to collide with the mechanics of the supply chain. To understand the true weight of a tariff, we must strip away the political rhetoric and look exclusively at the bank wire transfer. We need to identify who actually signs the check. There is a persistent misconception, often perpetuated by the language of charging China, that the foreign government writes a payment to the United States Treasury. This is false. The transaction does not happen in Beijing. It happens at the port of entry, Long Beach, Newark, Savannah. When a shipping container arrives, the legal entity responsible for the bill is the U.S. importer of record. This is often an American company, a retailer like Walmart, a domestic manufacturer importing parts, or a specialized middleman. The mechanism is cold and bureaucratic. U.S. Customs and Border Protection intercepts the goods. They calculate the tax, let's say the proposed 60% on a shipment of electronics. The American company must pay that 60% premium to the U.S. government before the goods are released into the economy. This creates an immediate financial crisis for the importer. Most of these businesses operate on razor-thin margins. They do not have a vault of cash deep enough to absorb a 60% or even a 20% increase in their cost of goods sold. They are faced with a binary choice. They can absorb the cost and face immediate insolvency, or they can pass that price on to the consumer who ultimately pays it. The tariff is designed to reduce demand for foreign goods, but in the interim, it functions simply as a pass-through tax. We do not have to guess how this mechanism plays out. We have the data from the 2018 washing machine experiment. This is a perfect case study because the variables were isolated, allowing economists to track the money with forensic precision. When the tariffs hit, the price of imported units from LG and Samsung skyrocketed, as expected. The foreign companies could not eat the cost, so the American shoppers saw the sticker price jump, but this is where the story takes a turn that the common sense narrative rarely mentions. The intuition is that domestic producers, companies like Whirlpool who were protected by the tariff and didn't have to pay it, would keep their prices low to undercut the foreign competition and steal market share. That is the patriotic ideal, but that is not how capitalism works. In reality, domestic producers saw that their competitors were forced to raise prices. Instead of holding the line, they raised their prices as well. This is known as opportunistic pricing. By raising their prices to just below the level of the taxed imports, domestic companies could increase their profit margins significantly, while still remaining the cheaper option. The myth is that taxing imports leaves domestic prices untouched. The reality is that it creates an inflationary umbrella. The tariff created more demand for US-made washers, and naturally, when demand rises, the price follows. The American consumer was trapped. They could pay the tax on the foreign good, or they could pay the margin markup on the domestic good. Either way, the household budget took the hit. The ripple effect did not stop at the washing machine aisle. It infected adjacent markets. The 2018 data revealed that the price of clothes dryers also surged. This is an anomaly because dryers were not subject to the new tariffs. Why would the price of an untaxed good rise? Because human behavior follows patterns. Consumers rarely buy a washing machine alone. They buy a matching set. Even though dryers were not directly targeted, they were indirectly affected by the shift in demand and the pricing power of the manufacturers. The inefficiency of the tariff bled into the broader market, inflating costs for goods that had nothing to do with the trade dispute. When you analyze the anatomy of this transaction, the conclusion is stark. The 2018 policy did not extract wealth from South Korea or China. It orchestrated a transfer of wealth from the bank accounts of American families to the balance sheets of American corporations and the coffers of the U.S. Treasury. The tax on the foreigner was, in practice, a tax on the domestic consumer, collected by the middleman. But surely, one might argue, this financial pain was worth it to bring the jobs back? If the consumer paid a premium, did they at least buy a manufacturing renaissance? The answer lies in the most expensive number you will hear today. If the goal of the tariff system is strictly financial, to strengthen the American balance sheet, then we must audit the results of the 2018 experiment. But the cold detachment of a forensic accountant, we need to measure the return on investment. The America First doctrine promised a revitalization of labor, but when we strip away the campaign banners and look at the payroll data, the efficiency of this strategy reveals a disturbing discrepancy. Let us return to the washing machine sector. The tariffs did in fact force foreign companies like Samsung and LG to open plants in the US to avoid the tax duties. The policy technically succeeded in its stated goal. It created domestic manufacturing jobs. Specifically, it created about 1,800 new positions. In a vacuum, this looks like a victory. But economics does not exist in a vacuum. We must ask, what was the price tag for those 1,800 jobs? Because of the price increases passed on to the consumer, that opportunistic pricing from both foreign and domestic brands, the American public paid an estimated $1.5 billion more for laundry equipment. When you divide that total cost by the number of jobs gained, the math becomes difficult to defend. The cost to the American economy was approximately $815,000 per job created. This was not a standard stimulus. It was a staggering inefficiency. As some economists noted, this is a very expensive job creation program. The consumer effectively paid a fortune to subsidize a handful of factory floor positions, while more efficient methods of increasing employment were ignored. However, the washing machine example was merely a skirmish. The real war was fought over raw materials, steel and aluminum. These tariffs were justified not just by economics, but by national security, aimed at punishing China for trade transgressions. The intention was to protect the upstream producers, the steel mills. But an economy is a chain. When you protect the upstream, you starve the downstream. All the industries that rely on steel to survive, construction, tool manufacturing, and the automotive giants, suddenly found themselves paying a premium that their foreign competitors did not. This created a competitive disadvantage. An American car manufacturer buying expensive, protected steel now had higher input costs than a European or Japanese competitor buying steel at the global market rate. The predictable result was a squeeze on profit margins and a contraction in the very industries that define American industrial power. Studies analyzing this period confirmed the downstream massacre. While employment in the protected steel sector stabilized, the broader economy lost jobs. The losses in the industries that use steel often equaled or exceeded the gains in the industries that make steel. The protectionist shield saved a few, but the ricochet hit the many. And now project this mechanical failure onto the 2026 blueprint. We are no longer talking about a single appliance or a raw material. We are talking about a universal tariff on everything. If the 2018 tariffs on a few items caused localized inflation, a blanket tariff creates a systemic shock. Independent studies modeling a universal 10% tariff and a 60% China tariff estimate the cost to the average American household would be roughly $1,700 per year. Other models suggest a potential loss of over 684,000 jobs across the economy. As consumption contracts and businesses cut jobs to survive, this is the invisible inflation tax. It is not deducted from your paycheck by the IRS. It is deducted at the register every time you buy a vehicle, a phone, or a piece of furniture. The promise is that this money will rebuild America. The reality, so far, is that it simply evaporates the purchasing power of the middle class. But the domestic cost is only half of the equation. In the laws of global economics, this principle is just as binding, though it often carries a delayed fuse. The fatal flaw in the isolationist theory is the assumption that the rest of the world is a passive observer, that foreign nations will simply accept a 20% or a 60% pay cut without firing back. History and the recent 2018 precedent proves otherwise. Foreign governments do not sit idly. They retaliate. And they do not retaliate randomly. They target with political precision. When the United States imposed tariffs on steel, the counterstrike did not hit American steel. It hit American agriculture. China targeted soybeans, the commodity produced in states that are politically vital. The European Union targeted motorcycles and bourbon, iconic American exports. This is the export trap. By attempting to block imports to save one industry, the United States inadvertently suffocates its own export markets in another. The logic of punishing a trading partner ignores the reality that those partners are also your customers. When you tax them, they stop buying from you. The result is a contraction on both sides of the ledger. U.S. imports might shrink, but U.S. exports shrink with them. But what of the grand objective? The primary selling point of the tariff strategy was to force manufacturing back to the Rust Belt, to bring the factories home. Did the China tariffs achieve this great reshoring? The data reveals a different reality. Companies did move, but they did not return to Ohio or Pennsylvania. They moved to Vietnam, India, and Mexico. To avoid the Made in China tariff, multinational corporations simply shifted their supply chains to neutral ground. They adopted a China plus one strategy. The factory in Shenzhen didn't close. It just routed its final assembly through Hanoi or Tijuana. The United States trade deficit did not disappear. It merely shifted geography. We stopped buying as much from China and started buying record amounts from Mexico and Southeast Asia. The systemic reliance on foreign labor remained intact. Only the shipping labels changed. The deficit is not a leak you can plug with a tax. It is a structural feature of the dollar's global dominance. Now we face the escalation. The proposed 60% tariff on China is not a trade policy adjustment. It is a nuclear option. At that level, commerce does not just slow down, it stops. This is no longer about fair trade. This is about decoupling. Or we are looking at the potential bifurcation of the global economy. On one side, a Western bloc walled off by high tariffs. On the other, a BRICS-led bloc centered around China, forced to trade amongst themselves and develop independent financial rails to bypass the dollar. This split creates extreme volatility. If the global supply chain is severed, the just-in-time efficiency that has kept prices low for 30 years evaporates. We are not just risking a recession, we are risking the stability of the global order that the US dollar was built to service. The gamble is that the US market is so essential that the world will capitulate. But in a game of chicken played with the global economy, the crash doesn't just hurt the driver, it destroys the road. And yet, despite these risks, despite the retaliation, the costs, and the geopolitical fracture, the policy persists. Why? Because the tariffs have mutated into something else entirely. They are no longer just a weapon of war. They have become a drug for the federal budget. There is a cynical maxim in Washington that every investor should memorize. There is nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. In the world of trade policy, this is not just a saying, it is an iron law. We call it the Hotel California effect. You can check out anytime you like, but the policy can never leave. To prove this, we do not need to look at 1963. We can look at 2021. When the Biden administration took power, the expectation among free trade optimists was that the Trump tariffs, which were criticized heavily during the campaign, would be dismantled. They were not. In fact, they were codified, strengthened, and in some sectors expanded. Why would an administration that ideologically opposes its predecessor keep his most controversial economic weapon? The answer lies in the seduction of institutional power. The first reason is the addiction of lobbying. Once a tariff is erected, it creates a protected class of domestic industries. Steel mills, aluminum plants, and solar manufacturers adjust their business models to rely on that protection. They hire lobbyists to ensure the wall stays up. For any president, Democrat or Republican, to remove that tariff is no longer seen as a return to free trade. It is framed as an attack on American industry. It becomes political suicide. The temporary shield becomes a permanent crutch. The second reason is leverage. In the brutal calculus of geopolitics, a tariff is a bargaining chip. Even if a president knows the tariff is hurting the American consumer, they cannot simply repeal it without getting a concession from the other side. Why should we disarm, the logic goes, if China hasn't changed its behavior? So the tariff remains, not because it is economically efficient, but because it is a piece on the chessboard that no one wants to sacrifice. But the 2026 blueprint introduces a third, far more dangerous reason for permanence. This is the aspect of the plan that receives the least coverage, but carries the highest risk. It is the concept of revenue replacement. Deep within the advisory circles of the America First movement, there is a discussion about a fundamental restructuring of the U.S. tax code. The ambition is not merely to protect factories. The ambition is to use tariff revenue to fund the federal government, potentially paving the way to eliminate or drastically reduce the federal income tax. This is a shift from taxing production, what you earn, to taxing consumption, what you buy. On the surface, this sounds like a libertarian dream. Keep your whole paycheck, tax the foreign imports. But for the money history student, this is a high-stakes gamble with the nation's solvency. Income tax is relatively stable. People earn wages even in downturns. Tariff revenue, however, is notoriously volatile. It depends on trade volume. If the tariffs work as intended and imports stop, the revenue stream dries up. If you're funding the U.S. military, Social Security, and interest on the national debt using the proceeds of a trade war, what happens when trade collapses? You have swapped a stable foundation for a crumbling pillar. Yet, once the government gets a taste of that trillion-dollar revenue stream, it becomes addicted. It cannot turn the machine off. This brings us full circle, back to where we started. The chicken, in 1963, the United States imposed a 25% tax on light trucks to punish West Germany for blocking American poultry. It was supposed to be a short-term slap on the wrist. West Germany is gone. The Cold War is over. The chicken dispute is a footnote in history books. But if you go to a dealership today and buy a foreign-made light truck, you are still paying that tax. The policy outlived the country it was meant to punish. This is the trap. The tariffs proposed in the 2026 blueprint, the 60% on China, the 10% on the world, will not be a 4-year experiment. They will weave themselves into the DNA of the American economy. Supply chains will break and refuse to heal. Industries will become dependent on the artificial price floor. The government will become addicted to the cash flow. We are still paying the bill for a trade dispute from the Kennedy administration. It is a near statistical certainty that the trade war of 2026 will be paid for by the workers of 2050. The blueprint is drawn in ink, but the legacy will be carved in stone. The era of free trade is officially dead. It has been replaced by the era of managed trade and economic warfare. The global system that prioritized efficiency and low prices has been dismantled, brick by brick, in favor of a new architecture built on leverage and national security. This blueprint is not merely about saving a few thousand manufacturing jobs in the Rust Belt. It is a fundamental re-engineering of how global capital flows. It is an attempt to force the world to pay a premium for the privilege of accessing the American consumer. The strategy is no longer to compete. The strategy is to charge rent. The stakes could not be higher. If this plan works, it could successfully reindustrialize the American continent and break the reliance on hostile supply chains. But if it fails, the consequences are catastrophic. It risks isolating the US dollar, fracturing the global market, and igniting a firestorm of hyperinflation that will erode the savings of the very people it claims to protect. The system is being reset in real time. The tectonic plates of the economy are shifting beneath your feet. The only question is, are you watching the politics, or are you watching the money? This is financial money history.